So before we get started, I know there's a million lenses to look through coaching. So I just want to acknowledge that and put that into the room. This is one. And Jonathan's someone I've known for quite a while and admire. Behind his back, I call him the mad scientist. He has this incredible mind and this incredible background that he brings to the work that he does. So I'm just really excited to share him with you and some of his perspectives that he brings to the work that he does. Yeah, so thanks for being here.
Thanks.
So would you start by sharing a little bit about your background, because it's pretty unique?
Yes. And
how you got to the work that you're doing now?
Thank you, I will. So when I share my background with you, you probably will think it's relatively unique for somebody in the work that I do. But let me first off say that, of course, everybody in this room has an extraordinary, unique background. And part of our power as servant leaders and change agents is, you know, uncompromisingly owning whatever that background is. But as relevant to the coaching model and the work that I do, so I grew up in a kind of out-of-control, crazy family, and didn't deal with that well emotionally. And so, so I had some important formative experiences come out of that. And the first one, and I don't think I've shared this with you, so this is my progression of taking advantage of these sort of opportunities to own more of who I am. So my first one was to be diagnosed in kindergarten as mentally retarded, and held back and put into special programs. And, and fortunately, there were enough adults actually paying attention to see that that was not accurate. And so eventually, I was able to extract myself from that. And then by the time I was an adolescent, I was some version of fully out of control and ended up in the criminal justice system. So I'm a former federal convicted felon. And fortunately, in those days, they had the youthful offender laws, so that when I came of age and I served my time, I could have my record expunged. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to have my career, because I wouldn't have been eligible for all sorts of things. But the crazy thing was, again, there were all the professional adults who saw me as incorrigible. But thank you, Swarthmore College. They gave me a full academic scholarship and got me out of that environment, and gave me an opportunity to do different type of work. And so, as you might imagine, my big goal in college was, I'm going to keep kids out of prison, I'm going to keep kids in school, I'm going to help girls not get pregnant, I'm going to try to disrupt domestic violence, you know, I'm going to try and take advantage of the good fortune that I had and help people in my sort of circumstances. So getting up to the current coaching model, I was able to get grants, I was able to design programs that were highly effective. But the big challenge was not helping people. The big challenge was getting the professionals to help people. And because people had these very fixed mindsets, this is an untreatable population, or they were unconsciously racist or misogynistic and just didn't see the potentiality. They were just insanely closed-minded. And so I ended up writing my PhD dissertation on how to get highly educated people to go through a paradigm shift. And given this mindful audience, how to help people become mindful, how to help people actually be present in the moment and pay attention to what's in front of them. And of course, along the way, I started going to meditation retreats as an adolescent as the best way I could figure out maybe how to heal myself. So, so the coaching model today is, you know, it's about working with systems, because none of us exist in isolation. All of us exist as part of systems and are made up of systems. And that's obviously true for a leadership team, being part of a greater organization, having direct reports. And then also, just how do you get people into a sufficiently mindful point of view that their minds and hearts are open to what is possible, and can lean into that in a collaborative, relational way. So that's my background.
So how do you do that?
So let me throw in some neuroscience. So we know that we're wired to survive and procreate. That's not a bad thing. But that predominates how we relate to people. And so I'll give you a simple example. So I was working with this coaching team, and one of their practices was to have a leadership team sit in a circle and all share their 360s with one another. And they would sort of apologize to those leadership teams. You know, this is going to be an ordeal. You know, we call it the circle of hell. But you'll be the better for it. You know, so see if you can tolerate the pain in the service of growth. So, you know, everybody comes in highly contracted, their amygdala's inflamed. And so one of my interventions was, circle of hell, this is the circle of love. You're not in the hot seat, you're in the gratitude seat. You're not sharing this painful information with your colleague, you're being generous. You're having the courage and you're caring enough about the relationship and the well-being of the organization that you're willing to show up and you're willing to accept the premise that no matter how tough and strong you are as a leader, and most of the leaders I work with are literally or figuratively endurance athletes. You know, they can tolerate extreme pain indefinitely. But this only diminishes them. So you know, we put people in relationship, and one of the things that we do is the work is always affirmative. We're always inviting people to go to the aspirational, not to the fear, to the prefrontal cortex, not to the amygdala. And as you know, Michelle works as one of our coaches. She's on the team. So there's more to it than that.
I'm a little biased.
You're a little biased. Yeah.
Can you give the lens a little bit more as far as you know, what lens you're looking through? And then I want to come back also, you mentioned that, you know, people are in discomfort, and that comes up so often when working with executives. I know you and I have had that conversation in the past before. So also to kind of give that lens of where that plays into your work with executives and in a system, you know, this kind of discomfort of the system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if we take some neuroscience and we take some group psychology and we take change strategy, what we know about people is that being part of a team, even people who love being part of a team, is inherently anxiety-inducing, and people develop defensive coping strategies. But also in my experience, the leaders I work with are extremely high integrity people, and they're also extremely competitive. So if you can educate them, hard science educate them about certain realities, you know, they'll lean into that and they'll do the work. So one of the things that I'm always telling leaders at the front end is no matter how smart you are, no matter how much domain expertise you have, nobody ever does their best work on their own. You know, that we're social animals, and neurologically, the way we process information is very different in a conversation than when we're talking to ourselves, you know, when we're preaching to the choir. And so, the new leader, the new, more conscious leader, has the humility to recognize that they're part of a system and that they have to, and what does that mean in practice? That means they have to start thinking systemically. They have to start thinking about what are the reciprocal relationships on this leadership team? How do we balance each other? So for instance, just did a retreat with a Fortune 500 team, and we used a tool called the Strength Finder. And part of the value of that was people owning, oh, these are my strengths, these aren't my strengths. And rather than being defensive or apologetic for an absence of strengths, how do we think collectively in terms of leveraging each other? Okay, so I think that's common sense, that smart leadership teams are leveraging each other. The part that's not necessarily common sense is really, and this is the core of our coaching model, is to understand systemic principles. So if I am all in and working really hard and I get ahead of my team, I'm not pulling my team along with me. That might be what I believe is true. I'm not pulling my team along with me. I'm inviting other members of my team to underfunction. I'm disempowering other people. And when I take a certain initiative, I'm blocking somebody else from taking initiative. And you know, dealing with the constraints, right? Because this is weeks and weeks of lectures and training. But really seeing that you're part of a homeostatic system, and everything you do has a profound impact of everybody else on the team. And so as a leader, if I can have the humility And the joyful humility is say, you know, I'm just one member of this team, and the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. If I become a student of how systems work, then I can be conscious and deliberate in what I do. And then if you combine that with mindfulness. So as you might imagine, you know, when I'm doing a business pitch, I'm never coming in saying, would you like to become a mindful organization? I will come in saying, do you want to leverage state-of-the-art knowledge on neuroscience and systems theory? And then when people start seeing the value of that, and they say, you know, I'm not consistent. I'm not consistently able to remember that I'm part of a team. Then it's time to introduce meditation. Then it's time to introduce various mindfulness practices where, and I tell people, you know, the best technology that I'm aware of to chill out the synapses, to borrow from the previous speaker, to not inflame the amygdala, which is more how I talk, is meditation. That's the best technology that's available. And then what we see over time is almost every individual that we work with, you know, downloads an app, engages us at least in a modest meditation practice, if not going to retreats and so forth. And then it's so cool to have Fortune 500 leadership teams starting off all their meetings with a 3 to 5 minute meditation and a clearing of the palate and being able to actually be at the meeting they're supposed to be at, as opposed to still working out the previous meeting or preparing for the next one.
And in working with these, I have a couple of questions in my mind, but in working with these systems and the coaches that you work with, which is many, I'm curious about two things. One, what are the edges that you're noticing coaches out in the field are needing to develop and work on to be able to efficiently, you know, help those organizations bring that new leader in? And I'll ask my next question after.
Okay. So to quote accurately or inaccurately Jack Kornfeld from one of his books, you know, 80% of spirituality is self-compassion. No, 100% of spirituality is self-compassion. And you know, for me, it's a big deal to sit in front of a group of people and talk about being mentally retarded and being part of the criminal justice system. And I have a lot of shame around that, right? And so what I see with coaches, what I see with CEOs, I specialize in CEOs, but I'm working with my team to coach everybody. What I see is always a tremendous amount of undigested shame. And you can get away with that, right? Because I've made it to this level. So I have a lot of status, I have a lot of stuff to compensate for the shame. So paradoxically, the more successful you are, the easier it is not to become a whole human being. And because what's the forcing function to get you to do the work? And so having people come to the realization of how circumscribed their effectiveness as a leader is because they haven't been able to integrate their shame, their failures, their what have yous into the whole person. And you know, we're all works in progress, right? But I certainly see this. I see this in very experienced coaches too, who have stalled out in their own work, and aren't doing the work on themselves that they need to do to be able to truly sit and pay attention to the clients that they're working with. And then if we can do it, you know, as part of building out an effective leadership team, if we can get people to sit in the circle of love and talk about who they are and where they're struggling and ask for help and offer help, that's just so cool. And somebody used the phrase addictive. You know, that becomes an addictive process. It's like it's more fun if you can get over the fear. It's more fun to truly be in collaboration than it is to muscle through on your own. So hopefully that's...
Yeah, that does. So peer coaching, like at that level, so they're really coaching each other.
At the end of the day.
At the end of the day. You know, they're willing to be vulnerable, and they're coaching each other. And you may have answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's your edge? You know, you've been doing this for a long time. What's your edge right now in the work that you're doing? Calming
down. you know, I'm seeking out a level of equanimity that allows me to just trust the work and trust the people that I'm working with, and not getting overly inflated or down on myself.
Yeah. And was that sharing in the beginning part of it? I'm curious. That's why I said I thought you might have answered my question. Was that vulnerability piece a part of your edge?
Yeah. Yes. I'm trying to, and just as a side project, before I started doing this work, I used to have theater companies, and I used to write plays about crazy couples and families, and I was a drama therapy professor, and so then I would have the characters in the play then be an improv and drama therapy interventions. And so I'm trying to get into a self-revelatory place and create my own narrative and integrate it. And there's an out-of-control egotistical part of myself where I want to show off, and I'm dying to get validated and get approval. And
none of us know about that.
none of us.
I don't.
You know, and clearly this serves no one, right? We all know that about each other, right? We all have compassion for one another around those things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And just to kind of dig into the drama therapy a little bit more, because you did that for a long time. Mm-hmm. That was a big part of your background, among a million other things. Like recently I found out you drove a taxi cab at some point back in your history. I mean, you've done a lot of different things. How does that inform the work that you're doing right now in working in systems theory?
So when I was a cab driver, it's just a story I like to tell. Okay. So is it germane? I don't know. So I get a bunch of people from Oklahoma in my cab, and apparently they've literally never been off the farm before. But there's something happened in their life. They've come to some sort of pig farmer convention in San Francisco. And they're pretty excited, and it's their first night in town. And I'm taking them somewhere. They tell me they're really disappointed because they've heard so much about Sodom and Gomorrah, but they haven't seen any homosexuals and they haven't seen any whores. And they're like, all this stuff they've heard about evil, decadent San Francisco, it's and they can't go home without having seen, some whores and homosexuals. And I'm sort of like, prepared to castigate them as these prejudiced, narrow-minded people, but no, they just want to know something that they didn't know about. So, so I drive them around the city. I take them to the Castro, and I take them to the Polk, and I take them to the Tenderloin, and they're like, okay. And they're very happy. They give me a big tip. And then a month later, the phone rings. Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenfeld. I understand you give a wonderful whore and homosexual tour. And I'm like, no, actually I don't. But I do hope you have a nice time when you're in the city. So that's a story about just being open, right? And what a privilege for me to sort of give these people who came in prepared to have prejudices sort of confirmed, and then allow them to see just a melange of humanity. And then another experience I had when I was driving the cab is my very first shifts were early in the morning, which was an ordeal for me. And I would be taking women to work, working class women to work, and they would look miserable. And I would say to them, you must really love your children. And they would sit up and they'd say, yes, I do. How do you know? I said, well, you clearly are not happy about going to work. So I figure you must have something really inspiring you that's really important to you. Okay, so I'm not answering your question yet, though.
Yeah. I'm waiting.
And the last cab story. So over time, I learned that the best way for me to make money was to work on the worst nights of the week. Because on the worst nights of the week, the cab drivers would be depressed. And they would get into predictable homeostatic patterns as the fleet would move around the city. And if you thought about the cab fleet as a system, as opposed to individual drivers, then you knew that when the dispatcher made certain announcement, the cab fleet would reflexively all shift in a certain direction. And I would always drive my cab in the opposite direction. And then when a call would come in, I'd be the only cab. So I'd make a very good living. The worse the night was, the more money I would make, because the more the system would fall into sort of a homeostatic lethargy. And this is what we see on leadership teams. Leadership teams that are very successful get complacent. Leadership and loss aversion kicks in. They're afraid of losing what they have. Leadership teams that are failing are in a state of terror and get very complacent because they're afraid to take risks. So human beings, you put them into packs, into groups, the bigger it is, the more people shut down, the more diminished they become by the nature of the team. And this is tragic because paradoxically, in general, teams will bring out the worst in everybody while potentially being able to bring out the best in everybody. But the best is counterintuitive. So if I can educate the leaders of a team about systems theory and I can point out to them, this heroic act on your part is actually disempowering everybody else. And you're sitting back and giving other people to talk is disavowing the weight that they need you to contribute to the room. So I don't know if I'm going into enough depth, but of course what people say all the time is, wow, I never thought about it that way. You know, I just thought about me being personally responsible for the success of this group. And the idea that, no, actually, all sorts of positive things I do are actually getting in the way of other people being able to be empowered. And if I can breathe and I can relax and I can actually pay attention, and then the mindfulness kicks in again, because I'll say to somebody, I observe a lot of leadership teams, and I'll say to somebody, do you realize when you did this how it affected the rest of the room? And they'll say no. And I'll point out to them what happened in the rest of the room that maybe wasn't so great. And then they get interested and they start paying attention. So then they all become systemic experts. And they all start thinking about, it's not me, it's the system. How's this team operating as a highly complex system? And I like to quote Darwin, hopefully accurately. It's not the smartest that succeed, it's not the strongest that succeed, it's the most adaptable that succeed, that survive. And if you think biologically, what is adaptability? Adaptability is biological complexity, right? Because single-cell organisms are not terribly adaptable. And so the more complex the system is, the more resources you have to be successful as an organization, as a business, whatever that involves. So when people start seeing that, when they start seeing the fact that the dynamics among their teams are not mysterious, they're actually understandable, and my role in my agency is something that I can become a student of and become ever more effective. And yes, and then peer coaching. Because, coaching 101, you don't want to foster dependency. You want to come in and do an effective intervention and get out. And so, and then of course, from our perspective, the coaching perspective, you don't want the team then to regress to where they were before, which can be really tragic. And so, yeah, so peer coaching. So then people holding each other accountable. And then as an incentive, of course, when we're working with a system to change, people are always capable of growing in so many different ways. We want them to grow in the service of business outcomes. And since they're being vulnerable with each other, they're all sharing the sort of mindset shifts that they're engaged in, the new behaviors they're practicing, and that's correlated to success, then they're going to hold each other accountable to continue to follow through on the behavior that's in everybody's best interest.
Yeah, so there's that individual behavior that they're working on, but it's in service of the greater system, always.
Always. Yeah. It always dovetails.
Yeah.
And all of us can grow in so many different ways. So what's you know, what's going to motivate us and what's most likely to endure over time. It's what serves the group, as long as it's serving ourselves.
And I want to ask one question just about the culture overall. You know, what are you noticing in some of the, I'm going to say the healthiest cultures that are present for this new leader that we're talking about today to be able to emerge? Like, what do you notice in the cultures?
Well, it's cliche, right? But it starts at the top. So it's so dependent on the nature of the CEO. What I'm noticing is courage and humility, and with an emphasis on both, because the leader has to be willing to go into a space that makes herself and everybody on her team uncomfortable in terms of vulnerability, intimacy, something not called spirituality, but something related to it. And then they have to have the humility to trust the process. That's the paradox, is they have to drive the process, but they can't control it. So they have to believe in their teams and create space for their teams, and care about people. You know, I mean, it's always amazing how many people rise up, and it's all about execution and numbers. Yeah. But that's a limited strategy, and it fails when you get at the top.
Thank you. And just one last quick question before we go. For all of the coaches here in the room and listening, that will listen later on, what's one piece of advice you can give them for their work in the world?
Breathe.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you all.